Hi, my name is Shoupe. I am a DMA candidate here at the University of Kentucky as well as a teaching assistant. And I'm here to kind of take you through the 2020-2021 All-State Secondary Etudes. These etudes do consist of 3 separate parts, a bass drum part, a tambourine part, and then depending on whether you picked keyboard or snare drum, you're going to have a xylophone or a snare drum part. For this first part, I'm going to walk you through the snare drum part for those of you who selected keyboard. With the snare drum etude, I mean, you're in 6/8, we have 8th notes, 16ths, 30 seconds, we have some dotted rhythms. It's a little notey, it's a little busy in a couple spots. Nothing in here is particularly tricky. It all kind of lays out the way it looks on the page. What does make this particular selection kind of tricky is the dynamics. We have forte and mezzo forte and sort of a passing back and forth between those two. And when dynamics are right next to each other like that, you have to always be careful that you keep them apart enough that they sound different, but not so far apart that you lose track of the dynamics on the outside. This selection still has a fortissimo and a pianissimo, which means you need to fit some dynamics underneath that mezzo forte so that you can come all the way down to pianissimo. It's not enough to have some room under the mezzo forte. There needs to be a mezzo piano, a piano, and then a pianissimo underneath that. Same with the forte. If we're going to go to fortissimo, that forte's got to be close to the top, but you still need that headroom to get a good tone at a slightly louder dynamic. Additionally, what does make the dynamics a little bit hard is with them being right next to each other, forte and mezzo forte, there are also accents in here which are going to try to cloud that sort of stratification of your dynamics. An accent in mezzo forte risks sounding like forte. And depending on who your teacher is, you might have been told that an accent is just one dynamic louder, which means it is a forte. So what I do with the accents particularly is I think of them as being quicker. I tend to move from a different place in the body, whereas most of my playing tends to be some combination of wrist, finger, and arm. These tend to be more wrist, and that brightens the sound considerably, so they sound different, almost like they're a higher pitch rather than being louder. That way I can still have a mezzo forte accent and a forte regular note that sound different, and it helps the listener kind of hear them as separate. There are also a number of quick rhythms here that are going to complicate your dynamics just a little bit. The closer the notes get together, the more the resonance of the instrument kind of takes over and the louder the audience perceives things. So when you have these 30-second notes, you really do need to try to negate their tendency to try to get blurry and kind of overwhelm the instrument a little bit. So what I do is I just think lighter. So instead of approaching the instrument whole-handed with a lot of weight, I will try to kind of lighten up, lift a little more, and that brightens the tone a little bit. It lightens the tone a little bit, helps maintain a sense of delicacy through there. It also helps them maintain a little bit more readability. And then with some details, we have some details in here. The third measure is going to present a little bit of a problem to you because you're in this piano dynamic, and then we go straight to the other end with forte with 2 accents and 30-second notes. And these are all going to combine to make that seem very loud very quickly. And also, just because of the nature of how we like to move, you're going from very small to very large. And so the tendency is to kind of overshoot that and really beat up the drum. So just make sure that you do keep that in check. It's only forte. You still have to leave room for that fortissimo. And then the last kind of detail with this is you only want to put accents where there are accents. Some of these rolls are going to have a tendency for you to want to accent the beginning or the end of them. For instance, right off the bat, the first measure, there might be a tendency to play it like this, which has a different sort of sound to it, or some people naturally kind of accent the ends of the rolls. You want to make sure there's only accents where accents are written. It's going to help keep this whole thing much clearer. Finally, equipment is not the make or break. You are the make or break. You are the source of the music. However, the equipment does help you on your way to getting the sounds that you want to get. With this particular etude, with everything being a little bit closer together, the dynamics being a little bit more narrow, and with our method of audition sort of being up in the air right now as I record this, you might be auditioning live in a large room, in a small room, or you might be recording at home or at your school with whatever space is available. With all of that taken together, I'm going to advocate that you use a slightly smaller snare drum. This is a 5-inch, the air column's a little bit smaller, and that kind of prevents the instrument from putting out a lot of sound at once. It keeps things a little clearer. Additionally, I tend to tune up a little bit. Since I recorded the performance part of this video, this drum's dropped a little bit, but keeping the heads a little tighter prevents them from moving as much air. It helps keeps things clearer. And then I also think about using a lighter stick. What's becoming very popular lately are laminated materials, and a few of the companies out there have released a lot of sticks recently made of laminated woods. Those tend to be quite heavy. I love them for ensemble playing, but if I'm in a smaller room with a microphone or one other person, I'm going to favor like a natural wood. These are made of hickory. They have a smaller bead compared to what I usually use to help keep that clarity. And the fact that they weigh less means they're going to move less air, so I can still play the way I would like to play without moving all the air out of the drum. So that'll just help keep things a lot lighter, a lot more clear, and ultimately make preparing this etude a lot easier. So for those of you who have selected the snare drum audition this year, your secondary etude is going to begin with a xylophone selection. This particular xylophone selection, it's also in 6/8, just like the snare drum one was. It also just doesn't have a whole lot in terms of weird rhythmic vocabulary. Measure 6 is probably going to be the most challenging one that you have there. What does make this one challenging is its key and its dynamics. So let's start with the dynamics. You're in the first measure at mezzo piano, and then you go to mezzo forte, and then you're at forte, and that's before you've even gotten to the third measure. Those are very incremental adjustments. You're not moving multiple dynamics. You're not going piano to forte. You're going one step at a time. So you have to be very metered in how you go up through those dynamics. You also do need to make sure that you start soft enough that you have that room to get to forte, but not so soft that you can't get down to pianissimo. This is actually a quite difficult thing to do on the xylophone because it is so brilliant and it is so sensitive. So if you're going to spend time on anything, I would really challenge you to make sure that that starting note is exactly where you need it so that you get tone, but you're not too loud, and that you don't swell into it. It starts cleanly. And just knowing what that feels like. Also, what is challenging about your dynamics here is you do have to have very drastic changes going from forte down to piano at the end of the first line and mezzo forte down to pianissimo at the end of the second line. If you look at measure 3, you're going from forte to piano, which is about 4 or 5 different dynamics over the course of just as many notes. So each note ends up being a different dynamic if you play this literally as it is on the page. And that's a very difficult thing to meter. So what I ended up doing is stretching that decrescendo out quite a bit. It's something that one of my teachers have always pushed. The crescendos and decrescendos very frequently do not start where they're written. And so they end up often aligning with the phrase. So I stretched that out so that the bottom of my decrescendo lines up with the end of the phrase. And that just sounds very musical, and it gives me a little bit more time to kind of get down to that dynamic. Now, it does mean you are adjusting the etude considerably, and that's something you'll want to talk over with whichever music teacher you have nearest to you most often, and make sure that they also agree that that is the best choice for you. Similarly, at the end of the second line, we're at mezzo forte, and then suddenly in the last measure we're at piano, and then pianissimo. And that's just very drastic. So what I actually ended up doing is extending that decrescendo out to the last G sharp, and then including that within the decrescendo, which not only gives me a little bit more time to get down to the proper dynamic level. It also creates this beautiful little almost slurred effect where the notes kind of blur together the way they would if a woodwind player was to play this. Another thing that does make this challenging, like I said earlier, is the key. It's in D major, which isn't a common band key. It has a lot of B minor chord, a lot of B minor arpeggio. There is some A major and some D major in there. What I do recommend is to create warm-ups for yourself that helps you find the notes faster. My personal favorite from my undergrad years. Something that just causes you to move up and down through the arpeggio in a variety of different ways. It helps your eyes kind of acclimate to what they look like. It helps your hands know where they are. Additionally, when you're learning the notes for this, almost every lick is based on one of those three arpeggios, the B minor, the D major, and the A major. Measure 1, for example, is entirely B minor arpeggio. Measure 2, we're looking a little bit more of the A arpeggio with a little bit of filler on it, just to kind of highlight that. Another thing that you can look for is how one measure becomes another. So measure 1 and measure 5 are very similar at the core of it, but measure 5 filled in measure 1 with some scalar motion. Similarly, 2 and 6 are related in a very similar way, but 6 is much, much more decorated compared to 5. But look for those moments where, oh, I've seen this before, it just had fewer notes, and use the thinner, more sparse version as a guide for your eyes or for your hands as you're going through and playing the selection. Don't learn note to note to note to note. Find your larger patterns. Use that to learn this piece faster so you can focus more on tone and shaping. Finally, you are the musician. You are where the music comes from, but you do have to express yourself through your tools. Making sure you have the right tools is important. When you're not playing with the ensemble and you're not playing in unison with other people, the hardness of your mallet can be much softer. The same mallets you would use when playing with a large ensemble are going to be far too brilliant for an ensemble setting or a solo setting. Also, like I've said, we don't really know how these auditions are going to be happening at this time. So if you're going to be recording like I am now, really bright, loud mallets are going to kind of overwhelm your mic really fast. It's going to sound really poor over the recording. So I prefer something with a medium plastic, hard enough to get that xylophone-like sound, not soft rubber, but not so brilliant that it's shrill. To make up for that, I tend to favor a smaller ball. So instead of that full 1 1/4 or 1 1/2 inch ball, this is a 1-inch ball. The smaller size makes sure that the contact area is a little smaller. It keeps the sound a little bit more compact and clear without forcing me to go to a brighter plastic. So with these kinds of situations, a small medium ball is going to be about perfect for this. So for both snare drum and keyboard auditionees, the middle of the etude is going to be bass drum. So in this particular example, rhythms are not difficult, and honestly with bass drum, you don't want very difficult rhythms most of the time. What this does really test you though is your control of dynamics with a resonant instrument, and it tests your tone. So if you're getting just a bad sound from the drum by hitting it too hard or in the wrong place, that's going to be the thing that, is going to separate one person from the other with this. A few things to consider is, first, you want to problem solve this particular piece. Everyone's kind of got their own way of playing bass drum. I'm very big on making sure that I have my foot on a chair so my knee can come in and actually dampen this head, which frees my other hand up to dampen as it needs to. You also need to make sure that you have strategized ahead of time where you're going to play. Most of the main notes are going to be near the center, not in the center, but near the center. I prefer to set myself up so I can just fall into it. And that way I don't have like harsh, compact sounds. I get these big, broad sounds. Things that you do need to be very alert to, this opening of the bass drum selection is very much in the vein of whole second suite movement 1 for those of you who have played that. Sorry, not second suite, whole first suite movement 1 for those of you who have played that. It's that idea of 2 beats over 3. So you definitely need to make sure if that's challenging for you that you're spending a lot of time not trusting your gut but counting through this. But more so, we want big, full, resonant sounds on this, but you won't want to lose your rhythm. So things to think about are like, how do you want to keep your articulation moving through the resonance of the instrument? There's a couple different ways to do that. Personally, I leave the drum wide open and I firm up my grip a little bit and snap a little bit more from the wrist. There's always a little bit of contact sound that gets the attention onto what I'm doing, and I don't have to kill any resonance. Another way that you could approach this, if you have a towel for your other mallet, is using this hand to dampen the batter head and let the resonant head fill in the hole for you. Takes a lot more coordination to get there. Could be very successful for some people. Another thing to consider is with the syncopations, this would be measure 17 and 18. Measure 17. That's a very quick turnaround, ba, 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 ba. Having that short, long idea that's audible. There's a few different ways to do that. Again, you can firm up and try to punch through the resonance a little bit. I found it easier to dampen the instrument on both sides for that, so that the 8th note, I touch the head a little more. And on the quarter note, I touch the head a little less. So I have 2 different sounds. And then my accent with a quick wrist snap. And that just helps the sound kind of, it helps the rhythm kind of carry through all the ringing that is bass drum. Finally, you do have a roll at the end of this. And a roll requires 2 mallets. Whereas the general playing area tends to be near the middle of the head, your rolling area tends to be out here at the edge. And so for those of you who have a little bit of traditional grip, this is actually fairly easy with traditional. Drop this arm down so it's almost straight down, and then leave this hanging, and you just play some single strokes. As far as the mallets that you use, you want to make sure that you have a general mallet. Rolling mallets just don't play rhythms as well. They're very poofy, they don't have a lot of mass behind them. Everything kind of sounds fuzzy with a rolling mallet. You will need something more general in your hands. Now, some generals are soft enough that they can still roll, and if you happen to have 2 of them, that's ideal. A pair of matching mallets that articulate the rhythm and can still roll. That is kind of a hard thing to find sometimes, and it costs a fair amount of money. So what most people will likely do is use their general mallet in the right hand and then keep a roller nearby, so that when you do get to the roll, you have like an actual roll sound. Because of how resonant the instrument is, the mismatched mallets aren't going to be as noticeable as they would be on another instrument. This one articulates, this one sustains the roll. You loosen up the hand enough, and the articulation out of the general mallet will kind of muddle a little bit, and you'll have a roll sound while still maintaining the correct mallet for the rest of the etude. All right, regardless of which audition you choose, snare drum or keyboard, you're going to end with the tambourine. Tambourine selection rhythmically is not going to present a whole lot of challenge. There is some syncopated rhythms that you do need to make sure that you are clear on. It is in 7/8, which is a 3-beat meter. It's got 2 short beats and a long beat. Usually the long beat's the first or the last, and in this one, it's often the middle, which makes showing the meter in your music kind of difficult because audiences are used to that long beat being the first or last. So a great way to think of that is the 3rd count is just lighter all the time. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. And that kind of helps the audience hear 1 where it actually is. So as you're phrasing through this, think about how you want those 3 beats to sound. If you're curious as to which beat is the long beat, the beaming shows you all the way through. There'll be 2 shorts and a long, 2/8 notes, 3/8 notes, 2/8 notes, or in a couple of them, 3/8 notes, 2/8 notes, and 2/8 notes. So just look for the beaming. It does highlight where these counts are. Also, another thing that makes this difficult, like with the whole etude, mezzo forte to forte, back to mezzo forte. It happens again and again and again throughout these secondary etudes. You do need to make sure that they are distinct, but not so far apart that the piano at the end is too soft, or that the other dynamics within the piece seem imbalanced. You really should, if you can, balance your forte to be the same across all 3 instruments. Obviously, there are 3 very distinct sounding instruments, so it's going to be a little bit challenging. It doesn't need to be exact. You just need to make sure that you have that headroom in the tambourine selection for that fortissimo that the other instruments do use. Another thing that makes this fairly tricky is towards the middle of the selection, end of the first tambourine line and the beginning of the last line of the etude, there's this just very long crescendo from 2 very narrow dynamics. You go from mezzo forte to forte over 2 measures. There's a couple things you could do. Is you can either really try to pace it so that it's very, very even and patient the whole way. You can what's called saving the crescendo, where you crescendo slightly in the first measure, you put most of it in the back end. That being said, these are very close together. It doesn't leave you a lot to work with. So what I end up doing is either undershooting the dynamic at the beginning, so starting a little quieter than I should, or ending a little louder than I should, and then settling to my target dynamic. And that gives you a little more room to really push the crescendo. Through that crescendo, you do have rolls. And we have 2 types of rolls on the tambourine, the finger roll and the shake roll. The shake roll, although once it's worked up is fairly easy to get in and out of, it does not do so well with dynamics. It can't really crescendo and decrescendo well. It's loud, it's what it does. So you are going to need to use both roll types. As you're going through it, with the crescendo, really just try to make sure the crescendo continues through the roll. You just end up applying a little more pressure and speed. And that way you don't have this like ta-ta-ta-zzz-da-zzz-da-zzz, and it feels more terraced. We want it to be smooth all the way through. Ta-ta-ta-zzz-da-zzz-da-da-da-zzz-da-da-da. It never really stops growing, even through the roll. So you're going to have to find ways using the 2 hands in contradicting motion to kind of help bear down on the rolls a little bit and help them grow. And then when you get to the end, you get to use your shake rolls. And those I really do favor the shake rolls there. They do have that beautiful forte sound. If they're practiced sufficiently, they start and end a little more cleanly and a little more consistently than finger rolls. You always have that scary moment with finger rolls where you don't get traction on the head and nothing comes out. So use the shake rolls when you get to the top of that crescendo. Also make sure that with all rolls there's a clear start, a sustain, and a release. You notice my shake rolls, I don't just, but I strike the tambourine to start and end. And it just helps keep our sounds consistent across all the instruments. All notes have an attack, a sustain, and a release of some sort. Don't let the tambourine just become sloppy because tambourine. Let it have that same clarity that snare drum would, for example. Finally, accents. Just like with the snare drum conversation earlier in the video, the accents of mezzo forte can leak into forte really easily. And so you can either be very diligent about your dynamics throughout there, or you can try to make the accents different. You can make the accents different by trying to move quicker and move from the wrist. That works with most percussion instruments. Or I think about pushing through the tambourine a little bit sometimes. And that, although not as easy to use in quick moving passages, it does provide this denser quality, and I find it more consistent than trying to bounce off the drum as the fast moving approach would. So you can either go bright or dark, but somehow try to get them to sound different than everything around them rather than just being a volume thing. And then finally, like as I've been saying throughout this whole video, you are the musician, the sound comes from you, but you should have the right equipment to make your job easier. concert etudes really do need to be played on a concert tambourine with a head. And that head should be prepared. A lot of companies send beeswax with their tambourine. Beeswax works great. You can get it at a craft shop for not a lot of money. Or if that's just not something that you can have access to, if there's a string program or a band supply shop nearby, you might be able to find base rosin relatively easy. It doesn't apply as easily as beeswax, and it doesn't last as long, but I actually really enjoy the tack of it, and it's a little more readily accessible to some people. Additionally, you'll see a lot of tambourine players like to lick their finger before playing these finger rolls. It's generally not a good idea if your instrument is shared. Also, we are in the time of face masks. Probably shouldn't be doing it at all. The good news is if you go to office supply stores up with the secretary supplies and like cashier supplies, they make these little pink pucks of some kind of substance, and it replaces the licking action. So, you know, some people like to lick their fingers before handling paper. This is intended for that, and it works just as well here. It actually lasts longer than licking your finger does, works more consistently, and it lasts so long you could probably apply it well before you get to the tambourine, and it'll already be ready to go. You won't have to worry about applying it and waiting for it to dry in the 4 measures prior to picking up the tambourine. So just making sure that you do have a usable tambourine that allows you to perform all these techniques, and also making sure that you've prepared it properly. And with that, we've covered all 4 instruments throughout these secondary etudes. They are meant to be played top to bottom without break, but because of the nature of having to explain them, I did break them up for you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the UK Percussion Studio. We can answer questions and be of assistance if you don't have access to a teacher where you're at. Yeah, I hope this has been helpful for you. Good luck in your audition.